Hi, I'm Kathryn Jean Lopez from National Review and the National Review Institute. So grateful to have my friend Matthew Bunson from EWTN. You are Vice President for News and Things.
Yes, I'm news and things. That's exactly right. Vice President Editorial Director for EWTN News.
And EWTN is the global Catholic network, and many people are probably more familiar with EWTN in recent weeks because of the Pope's funeral and the Pope's election and all that transpired between that. You just got back from Rome. You're in Washington D.C. now, but you spent over a month in Rome.
I did. So I was literally on the first plane out of DC that the afternoon of Pope Francis's passing, and I
Oh,
returned late last Friday. So
wow.
yeah, so it was the longest time I spent sort of in Rome for any of our coverage. We covered synods over the years, canonizations, but this was an unusual moment, but historic and truly just a privilege to be there and to be able to have a front row to history, but also to talk a lot about it.
And did you have any idea that you would be there for the election of an American pope, a US born pope?
Uh, well, let's just say conclaves tend to create a lot of surprises, and certainly that's been the case historically. I will say that pretty much from the moment that I arrived, so that was the morning of the 22nd of April, I began being asked and then asking, tell me more about Francis or Robert Francis Cardinal Prevost. He had been landed on people's radar somewhere along the line. And as the days progressed, his name just kept circulating. So that I can honestly say that by the days leading up to the actual conclave, when they went into the Sistine Chapel, he was at the very top of my list of the Papabili and was of increasing interest to me personally, but to a lot of other people. At the same time, though, everyone would assure you, and I had similar reaction too, that yes, he ticks all the boxes that you could possibly want for somebody to be Pope, but it's an insuperable problem for him that he's an American, that he's US.
And the practical point of that has always been we're a superpower. We are the superpower. That
That's right.
wouldn't be a good thing for the Vatican because we'd be throwing around too much weight, or he'd look like he'd have to step back and because he's an American. But the Cardinals did manage to find an American, or the Holy Spirit gave us an American, God gave us an American who it was acceptable because he spent so much time outside of the United States, frankly.
That's exactly right. You have to be careful how you say this, but because the Cardinals found somebody who wasn't un-American, because he's clearly American. I mean, this is a Chicago White Sox fan and all of that, but he's very non-American in the sense that, to your point, he was gone for so many decades. He's a naturalized citizen of Peru, even though he's still a U.S. citizen, born here. But there were some cardinals, apparently, as they were first getting to know him or first trying to get a sense of who this person was, that various other cardinals had talked about. They weren't even aware that he was U.S. born.
Oh,
Uh,
funny.
they simply understood that this is somebody who had been in Peru for a very, very long time and that they had had some dealings with in his role as the prefect for the dicastery for bishops, which is the office that helps appoint bishops all over the
Where
world.
he had been for the last few years in Rome.
Exactly. He spoke perfect Italian. He spoke perfect Spanish. To the degree that they heard his English, it was unaccented, but that might not necessarily tell them anything. So his reputation was certainly one of, well, as Cardinal Chomely from South America said, he has one mouth but two ears. So he had this remarkable reputation for building consensus, for listening, for exercising great prudence. So at the end of the day, I think it was Cardinal Daniel DiNardo, the Archbishop Emeritus of Galveston, Houston, right after the conclave, all the American cardinals gathered at the North American College and they gave an interview. And he said that he was seen more as a universal figure than as an American figure. And I thought there's an interesting take on it. So at the end of the day, him being an American just didn't matter.
and didn't even register at first with some people, which is funny coming from, of course, an American context where the story is about us,
Yes.
obviously. The day of, actually, an Uber driver asked me about the Pope, not knowing that I had been spending all my time thinking about the Pope and writing about the Pope and whatnot. And I said, and she was really excited he was an American, and I said, but not from New York. Can you only imagine if he was from New York, we would be insufferable? And she said, yes, that is true. So at least he's only from Chicago.
He's from Chicago, very much from Chicago, and I think that's part of the story. As we say, he's a White Sox fan. Our mutual friend, Monsignor Roger Landry, made the point that that means he's used to suffering, and he said, well, at least he's not a Red Sox fan, so points off for that. Uh, but he is very much
Father Landry being from Boston.
yeah, exactly. For the additional clarification. Um, yeah, I mean, he's certainly, let's put it this way, hearing him speak English as Pope Leo XIV, I will confess, was slightly jarring. So he said Mass the day after his election and opened the Mass in the Sistine Chapel with the members of the College of Cardinals who had just elected it, with this sort of an extemporaneous little message in English. And not to hear English with an accent from a pope. I can still hear it growing up as a kid, Pope St. John Paul II talking to Americans, and his English was perfect, but it was still very clearly a Polish accent. Benedict XVI had that beautiful, soft German accent, or the Bavarian accent in English. But here, this is a Midwesterner. This is somebody from Chicago speaking English, and it's really quite something to hear, and you can see the reaction of other people.
And also, we hardly ever heard English out of Pope Francis.
That's right.
So it is even more so. Your publicist would kill me because I have not held up the book, which doesn't work well with my with my fake screen here. But part of the reason we're talking is because you have a book, a portrait of the first American Pope, Leo XIV. And so you went to Rome, came back with a book. Was that the plan initially?
Uh, let's put it this way: that we hope to do books on people, but really, from the moment of his walking out, I should say, from the moment that they said eminentissimum, reverendissimum, and then announced Robertum, Franciscum, and then Prevost, taking the name Leo XIV. So basically, from Annuncio Vobis, there was just a general consensus. No, we need to help people understand who Robert Prevost is, who's now Leo XIV. So, as you know, I've done similar books. I did one in 2005 for Pope Benedict XVI, and then another one in 2013 for Pope Francis, all within a similar time frame. This one was just a little more constricted because I was there. And this time I had more help in terms of research and other things. Thank heavens for it, especially my wife, Bonnie, whom you know, was also grateful that, because as she joked, she would fall asleep and I was typing, and she'd wake up and I was typing. So burnishing her credentials as a saint. But there was a sense of intense interest, but we also recognized that people need to be introduced to him, but in a way that can get past some of the assumptions people make, and realistically too, some of the direct misrepresentations and things that we're already seeing about it.
Well, I do have to say, EWTN and Sophia Press were really on the ball because you can buy this on Amazon today.
Yes.
You can buy it from EWTN, from Sophia's website, all the regular places. How long did it actually take to write the book?
About a week.
Okay, because I noticed you have his speech to there was an Eastern audience,
Yes,
6 days in, I think, right?
yes, the Eastern Catholics.
So I mean, this is hot off the presses with as much information as you could have gotten in there, as
Yeah,
fresh as information.
so really right up until the day that we went to print with this book. I was looking at it and adding and just additional details. I'm happy to say that the general thesis or the central argument in some ways of the book has been validated with each passing day as we see more of his sort of papal magisterium, of his approach to things. And to be honest, he has been very upfront, very clear about what I think he wants for the church. And it all starts with his Episcopal motto, the one he took in 2014, 2015, when he became a bishop in Peru, and that is in illo uno unum, which is a line from St. Augustine, the great Augustine of Hippo, from his commentary on Psalm 127. And basically what it says is that in Christ we are one. He announced, the first thing he said as Pope, literally the first words were "Peace be with you."
Mm-hmm.
But then he's very specific. It's not just a vague, idealized concept of peace. It's the peace of the risen Christ. So in other words, it's the peace that only Christ can bring in. But that means there's impulse toward unity if you have that peace. And I think unity is going to be one of the hallmarks of his pontificate, pulling in all these beautiful threads of Catholic teaching. But he really does want to be a unifying figure. He's the term pontifex. It means bridge builder. I think he really does want to be building those bridges internationally, globally, for the whole world, but in particular, building bridges within the church, certainly at a time when it seems, at least, in a lot of quarters, there's division.
And not building bridges in endless dialogue kind of way that makes people roll their eyes, especially, let's say, for lack of a better way to put it, conservative Catholics. um, Many people, Cardinal Tobin of Newark among them, you quote as saying, "This man is decisive. He knows who he is. He's decisive. He'll listen to you, but he will make a decision."
That's absolutely right. Yeah. As I think Tobin at that press conference made the point that he doesn't start fights, but he kind of alluded to the fact that no, he'll end them. I
Right.
mean, he will make the tough decisions as he needs to. But at the same time, he's somebody who, in getting there, will listen to a variety of different perspectives. He will discern. He will try to build consensus. And then after he has weighed everything, he will make a decision. And I think that's a healthy style of leadership. To that point, he was head of the Augustinian order. He's basically essentially the first pope from the order of St. Augustine. And he served there for over a decade, traveling the world, dealing with all the problems that a religious order will have. And it was said that at the end of it, no one felt that he had done them an injustice.
Yeah.
When he had made a decision, it was the right one. It may have been something you might not necessarily agree with, but you understood how he got there, and he treated you with dignity and justice.
Did you feel confident as you were going through the background materials and hearing what people were saying in the early days that
Yeah.
it wasn't just kind of happy talk to be friendly to the new pope?
Right.
It does seem striking to me, though, that there seems to be no one who's ticked off about him being pope, because they hold some grudge. At least we haven't heard from them yet.
And something tells me that we would have. I even joked on our on-air coverage, just sort of preparing everybody. I said, remember that whoever it is, this is before his election, whoever walks out on the loggia, whatever name he takes, everyone within 2 minutes will suddenly become an expert in this person. and, and so I said, just be prepared for hot takes and immediately sizing up that we're all doomed. And we saw a few things like that with Francis. But I think within a week we had a pretty good read on where Francis was going to take us, and I think we have a pretty good read here. But to your point, I think you're absolutely right. I have not seen a lot of great unhappiness outside of a few tiny quarters that somehow this is a terrible decision on the part of the College of Cardinals. There seems to be one point I made was that I think going in, the composition of the College of Cardinals was deceptive in the sense that everyone assumed that you had 108 of the 133 electors who walked into the Sistine Chapel were all appointed by Pope Francis. That somehow they're all going to be ideologically in lockstep, and what we were going to get was some sort of a hard-edged progressive.
Right.
When in fact, when you looked at the individual biographies and where they came from and what they said as cardinals, this is an incredibly diverse group, but it tended to be very moderate, not mushy, just very concerned with what is the good for the church. And from that standpoint, I think that's exactly what they were looking for. They wanted somebody who'd be able to pull together all of the different, I won't say factions because that's too political sounding, but to solve many of the problems that we have by building a consensus that does not deviate from the teachings of the church, but also brings a certain calm solutions to problems. And the one thing that I have heard from both sides, I got, like you, I have a lot of friends who are progressive. I have a lot of friends who are very, very conservative. Those who dealt with them, the Italian media calls him Papa Calma. He's a calm pope. But
Mm,
I've also heard the word serene, sereno. So he's a
mm.
very serene type of a person. And I think that's exactly what the college was looking for after 12 years of a very specific type of a pontificate of Francis. And that's not even a criticism of Francis, it's simply his style of governance.
Well, it is striking. Again, in the first days, weeks after Pope Francis came in, we did get some stories about, problems he had had with Jesuits in South America, with political
Right.
problems. There was a sense that he was a complicated figure, and that certainly bore out, right?
Yes, it
Um,
did.
and, and there is something that seems undramatic about, even though he's clearly led a dramatic life in some respects,
Mhm.
leading his order and being a missionary in the poorest of poor places, right? And
Staring
now
down
being
armed
elected.
gunmen from the shining path in Peru.
Right, right. And yet, yeah, there is this peace and serenity about him, it appears. And the word I keep using, very politically incorrect though it may be, normal. He just strikes me as
Right.
normal, strikes us as normal, which is not to criticize anybody else in the past.
Yeah, no, I think there is about him this calm.
And
And
the brothers help, by the way.
yes, very fair. Those who worked with him, for example, the dicastery for bishops, and this is also true of the leadership of the Augustinians, they couldn't remember a time when he sort of flew off the handle when he got furious about something. It doesn't mean that he's sort of oddly disengaged from things, or that he's just emotionally numb, but rather he looks at a situation and seems able to sort of separate himself from these quick emotional responses that people have. And I think that's in part because of his personality,
Mhm.
growing up in these different environments. But he's clearly somebody who can adapt to new situations with almost stunning capacity. How the ease with which, for example, he went from the U.S. environment directly into Peru just 3 years after his ordination in 1982 tells you something about a capacity to adapt.
Right.
That's a skill that he's continued to develop. But also, then I think he has truly, really come to embody the spirit of the Augustinian order, which is that combination as their traditional motto and their traditional symbol is on his coat of arms right now. It's a heart aflame, pierced by an arrow, which is the theological virtue of love, resting on a book with the gospel. So it's this combination of the heart, but also the mind. And I think holding things in that balance, but also not allowing yourself to be carried away in either direction. And I think he's apparently pulled that off based on everything that we're seeing so far.
I was struck by, and it's not that it was the first time I saw it or anything, but in your book, you focus in on restless heart, that great theme of Saint Augustine. Our hearts are restless until they rest in you, O Lord. And when you see it in Latin, it almost hits you even more, maybe because we don't see it as often as the English. Cor inquietum, the
Yes.
lack of quiet, right? Um,
Right.
and I remember when Pope Francis was in the United States when he canonized Junipero Serra in Washington, D.C., and he
We were
talked
both
about,
there.
sorry.
We were both there, I
We were
think.
both there over by Catholic University. And a very hot sunny day, I remember.
Mhm.
But a beautiful day. And he talked about how Pope Francis talked about how we go through life anesthetized, how we're trying to numb ourselves because of this restlessness that we don't know where to go to with, right? And of course, God is where the church is inviting people to go to, and that really is you almost see like a seamless transition from Francis to Leo in knowing that people are desperate. And in all times they're desperate, but there's something about the fact that you couldn't count the number of live streams on the chimney. Everybody seemed to be fixated on what was going on in Rome. And that's just so clearly to me that people are looking for God, whether they know it or not.
Right. Well, I made the point of, in fact, I think it was the day of the white smoke. It was the day of the white smoke that I think back on, but where we were positioned in St. Peter's Square, we had a lot of different sets right next to us. We had ABC, we had, I think, CNN had a post there, and NBC had a post there, and there's a German network that was there. And I said that all of them, well, not all of them, but many of them assure us on a daily basis that religion doesn't matter, that the popes, the Catholic Church is sort of passe. I said, if that's the case, then A, why are you here in St. Peter's Square?
Right.
Getting massive amounts of money to cover this. And then B, why did you, when the white smoke came, the level of excitement on all of those sets as they scrambled to get onto the air, it's the white smoke came, that it simply reveals that in their hearts, they understand the significance of this moment, why the Pope actually does matter, and who the Pope is, and what the Pope says. It matters to the modern world because there is this hunger. As you say, creatum quod nostrum est donec requiescat in te. Our hearts are restless until they rest in you. And there is that peace that people are seeking, but it's a peace that you can only find by pursuing the truth, and that truth happens to God.
And you make the point in the book that one of the bridges that Pope Leo I'm not used to it
I've
yet.
got it done it myself.
I feel for the priests who keep making the mistake during the Eucharistic prayer. They say the wrong Pope.
Imagine how bad it was if you were a priest in Rome
Oh goodness.
without your Pope and your bishop.
Right. Good point. I hadn't thought of that because in the Eucharistic prayer you say both. That's true. Um, Pope Leo's seen both the the devoid, what happens when you're devoid of God in the West, and he's seen the richness of faith in the poorest violent situations in Peru, and that does put him in a very unique role as our new pope.
Yeah, I do believe that there were many cardinals at Sistine Chapel who have vast experience in the church around the world. Leo, Robert Gravost, brings a particular set of experiences that I think are going to be especially important in the coming years. The first is that lived American experience, the beauty of family life, growing up in a Catholic middle class family in Chicago, the experience of that, the changes that came about as a result of the Second Vatican Council, that I wrote in the book. But then to go from that to the remarkable lived experience of the missions in Peru,
Mm.
then to emerge out of that to study Malone for all things of doctrine and law. So he's an expert in the church's laws, right at a time, though, when it was very focused also on pastoral care of souls under the laws of the church. We had that, and then he ends up roaming the world of church of the Augustinians. And then he goes back to Peru. So he has this very interesting global perspective on the faith around the world of seeing up close the problems that his priests in the Augustinian order would confront. This is the great mendicant missionary orders, the history of the church. And then when we go back to the time of great unrest in Peru, then he ends up in Rome, where he deals on a daily basis with the problems and challenges of the world's bishops. So this is a pretty impressive skill set that he brings, but it's also a pretty mind-blowing set of experiences that he's able to build on.
I've been making the point that it's kind of a miracle that you've got somebody who is US born, who you can't ID as MAGA or anti-MAGA. He's, not easy to characterize, put in category, but also, or label, but also to have a missionary who's a canon lawyer, somebody who's met who met the founder of liberation theology, but yet no question is has an adherence and feels himself a steward of the magisterium, and we expect clarity from a canon lawyer, which is something, whether you loved him or didn't. Pope Francis maybe wasn't the clearest, which is, God gives us different temperaments, different skill sets. And I do believe God gave us Pope Francis and as well as Leo XIV. But it is really remarkable, again, to have that mix.
Yes, yeah, and I think that was one of the things that the cardinals were looking for. We know, for example, in the discussions of the general congregations, or the meetings of all of the cardinals, even those who could vote and those who couldn't, so in other words, those who were over 80, they were still entitled to take part in all the discussions because they're part of the College of Cardinals, which has the task of taking care of the church during the interregnum, the sede vacante, after Pope dies and the election of the new one. There were expressions of a couple of things. The first was that there was a certain lack of clarity that accompanied many of some of the statements of Pope Francis, but also that certain lack of clarity in terms of the law and how it was applied. And in Pope Leo, they have somebody with a doctorate of canon law from Angelicum, which is a very, very fine school, the pontifical or papal universities in the church.
And a Dominican school too. We talk about the Augustinians, and we had a Jesuit in Francis. The Dominicans he was schooled by.
Precisely. That also produced Pope St. John Paul II. So as alum go,
not too bad.
Pretty good pedigree. But he
also with an American rector who is a hillbilly Thomas, sings bluegrass.
Yes, Thomas Joseph White. I love the title. He has Rector Magnificus.
Yes.
Yes, and it's true. But
he's not too shoddy himself.
No, exactly. But we're seeing and have seen really from the beginning that Pope Leo does not leave a lot of loose ends when he gives a talk. We saw that even in 2023. It made the rounds in social media. A presentation he gave back in Peru. I think you know what I'm talking about. It was a commencement address and the honorary doctor and all that. But he was talking about the famous so-called seamless garment of the late Cardinal Joseph Bernadette, where he talks about we need to weave all of this together to a seamless garment of the issues facing the world. So that's abortion, euthanasia, but then the death penalty, and everything else. Now that has, over the years, been manipulated or misrepresented in a lot of corners. And somehow abortion now is the same level as a discussion about federal policy on spending, or something even similar like the death penalty or questions of migration.
And there, of course, in the moments after he was elected, there was immediate concern about that because he's from Chicago, where Bernardine was from.
Exactly. So you go back to 23 when he was giving this presentation. He had just been named to the dicastery for bishops. His rise was recently, he used that crass political meteoric. So he talks about that. He talks about this approach to things. But then at the very end, that's what I mean, he doesn't leave loose ends. He goes back and clarifies. Now, let's be clear, he says, that there is, in fact, a hierarchy, that as we approach these issues, the church's teaching is very clear on the seriousness of some versus others. I'm paraphrasing slightly, but essentially, he clarifies in that same speech what the church actually teaches on these different issues. So, yes, there is this need for sort of a consistent or holistic approach to the issues that we face, but let's not demote abortion or other issues into something that there's some kind of an equivalency among all of them. So he closed that loop. So he didn't leave it hanging out there. And you see that in almost all the speeches in Roman since, certainly since he's been elected Pope. He speaks clearly. And there's a lack of ambiguity in a lot of the things he says, but he's also dropping in some pretty strong statements. I think of his statement of his address to the diplomats who are accredited to Holy See. He didn't have to put in when he talked about the family, a stable family of a union of a man and a woman.
And
He didn't have to do that, but he did that deliberately.
mm-hmm. Of course, there was that funny NBC headline that essentially said, "Breaking news: the Pope is Catholic. He's against abortion and for marriage between a man and a woman." And it's important to bear in mind that Pope Francis was actually clear on these issues.
Yeah, I mean, some of his strongest statements were on abortion.
And gender issues, saying that it was like a nuclear war on the family. These trans issues and the gender fluidity issues. And we should say too that Cardinal Prevost has been clear on these gender issues as well.
Mm-hmm.
I laughed this morning. I was flipping through your book again, and you make the point that, like Leo the 13th, his namesake, he will aggravate people of all ideological persuasions. And of course, this morning there was some social media and other buzz about the new head of the Pontifical Academy for Life, and the initial among more conservative types, there was initial happiness that the old guy was out. But then people started sifting through some of the the press statements and things from the new guy, and so there's some concern that he's voiced some he has some unclear comments, let's put it that way, on assisted suicide and contraception. What do you make of all of this?
Yeah, well, I first I think we have to put it into some context. That it is first striking to me that Pope Leo, yes, Archbishop Pollio, who has been a controversial head of the JP2 Institute as this chancellor, and of course we saw in the 12 years of Pope Francis sort of a massive change at the John Paul II Institute for Studies on Marriage and Family. I give the full title so that everyone knows exactly what we're talking about. It was established by Pope St. John Paul II. That a lot of controversy surrounding Archbishop Paul. Yes, he turned 80, but his health seems fine. I don't think there was any great sense of massive urgency to replace him in that role, and then also as president of the Pontifical Academy for Life. So the way that Pope Leo went about it was first to accept Archbishop Pollio's resignation, having turned 80, and then restoring the way that it had always been, which was that the role of that particular role of chancellor of the John Paul II Institute belongs or falls under the vicar for Rome. Now, I know this is all sort of inside baseball, but essentially the post representative to help run the Diocese of Rome. And part of that is that you are also essentially the symbolic head of the Pontifical Lateran University, where the John Paul II Institute is happily, or used to be happily, ensconced. So in some ways, what Leo did there was to go back to custom and tradition, which is something we've certainly seen him do a lot, of going back to a lot of these papal traditions and the way things used to be run. So that took care of one problem immediately. The next was the question was, what was going to happen with the Pontifical Academy for Life? So his solution was a simple one. He's simply promoted from within. The chancellor of this pontifical academy has simply been promoted to this role. Now, there's no question that there have been over the years some peculiar statements, but on the other side, they're certainly not as controversial, at least in my opinion, and people are perfectly free to disagree with me, including yourself, not rising to the same level of controversy as we saw with Archbishop Polygon. And he has certainly been very strong on a lot of these issues of euthanasia and abortion and bioethics. He is himself a trained bioethicist. So I think one thing that we're going to see, and let's go back to that, he was originally appointed into that academy by Pope Benedict XVI. So we're starting to see again playing out on practical personnel decisions. One of the things that we're seeing that Pope Leo is doing across the board in terms of homilies and statements and other things, where he's pulling in different threads, not just from the pontificate of Francis, but from all of his recent predecessors and the teachings of the Church and the Second Vatican Council. So I think there is this effort to integrate. Is one of the words that I think is going to become attached to this pontificate. He's integrating all of the previous pontificates. And I think he found in the new president for the Pontifical Council, for the Pontifical Academy for Life, somebody who is going to be able to be faithful to the magisterium, but especially in what I think we will see in the coming days, Leo's vision for it.
Well, it should be said, I mean, this is day one of the new president, and we're still learning. But the question on assisted suicide seems like a prudential question. I'm not saying I agree with him. I'm not even sure. I actually, to be honest with you, had a hard time following the whole thing. But it was a prudential question. The contraception question bothered me a little bit more when I was reading up on it. But again, he wasn't, it didn't seem like he was trying to suggest a change in theology. And oh, by the way, the Pontifical Academy for Life can't change church teaching.
Correct.
So that's important to bear in mind too.
These are bodies of academics.
Right.
One thing that we can add is that there has been added controversy around some of the people who've been appointed to some of these pontifical academies and some of the people over the years, these last years, who have been invited to major events, synods, for example, and conferences, who've been asked to contribute, some who clearly hold positions that are contrary to the teachings of the Church. One part of Pope Francis's style was to bring people together with whom he might not necessarily agree to get their perspective. He allowed that same style in the different synods. At the end of the day, though, he was the one who always made the decisions on what to do with what they say and what the kind of reports and documents they produce. Classic example was the Amazonian Synod, where it seemed as though many of the participants were pushing for things like an end to clerical celibacy in the church and the ordination of women deacons. Pope Francis accepted none of their proposals, wrote his own exhortation after the Amazonian Synod, basically just saying thank you, but no thanks. So this was always a hallmark of Pope Francis, that he allowed everyone to be heard, but for himself never changed church teaching on anything.
I know it makes some people nervous, myself included, when you hear about synod and synodality, and see pictures of Pope Leo at the synod, including one at the table with Father James Martin, who of course is known for some controversial issues. You make the point, though, that he and this is I think comes right after you quote Cardinal Tobin saying that he doesn't pick fights, right? That he listens, but he also has in a democratic way, but he also respects hierarchy. What do you mean by that? And what's kind of like, is he the best of this whole synod thing that we're talking about?
Yeah, well, he's got aside from some of these personnel decisions, including who's going to succeed him as head of this office for bishop, because I think that's going to be a major appointment,
Hmm,
because it sets the tenor for how they're going about picking bishops around the world.
sure.
One of the two big decisions that are right in front of him. One, what to do about the Germans and their synodal path, which is systematically, obdurately, stubbornly, and arrogantly trying to unravel church teaching on terms of authority in the life of the church, the church's teachings on sexuality, the priesthood, and the ordination of women. But he's also has to decide what he's going to do with the synod and the whole project of synodality that he's inherited, albeit in incomplete form. And I say that because we have 10 reports that are due from these study groups dealing with the controversial issues that had emerged sort of out of the discussions of the Synod. Then the other is what to do with this gathering in 2028 that all the churches around the world between now and then are supposed to be assessing. So how's it going when you're implementing synodality? And at a time when, even after what, almost a decade in which we talked about synodality, in which we had the 3-year process of the Synod on synodality, and they still have a real struggle defining what it is.
Right.
I think this is one of the major tasks for him coming up. And he has given us a few clues when he met with the body for interreligious dialogue, representatives of different faiths. He talked about synodality as an instrument for dealing with those relationships. Now, that's admittedly, in terms of the potential controversies and ambiguities surrounding synodality, the relationship with other religions isn't a particularly difficult one. The idea of synhodos, of walking together, that's easy. And I'm not saying that he's being deliberate, trying to obfuscate here, but I think that in terms of applying some of the basic concepts of synodality to your relationship with other religions isn't that controversial. He does, however, he talks about the fact that he connected when he was talking with the members of the College of Cardinals. He listed some of the things that are important. He said collegiality and synodality. So which is a different approach than we have seen, because what it's doing is connecting synodality or the synods back in some ways to what it's supposed to be, a synod of bishops. So I think he's a great respecter of the role of bishops in the life of the church. There has been, admittedly, some confusion coming out of Pope Francis's pontificate of what exactly that looks like as a result of some of the synodal discussions. So if that's the path he's taking, then I think we're going to see this continuing progress of his vision for synodality, but it's going to be one that looks much more, as you say, hierarchical, much more attuned and anchored to some of the traditional understandings of the church in terms of things like collegiality, which is the union of bishops all over the world, and their rightful authority in the life of the church as successors of the apostles.
Well, you make the point too in the book, and it'll be interesting. Again, this is inside baseball kind of stuff.
Yeah.
But Pope Francis made some appointments in Rome that, while it got some people's attention because there were women involved in some of these cases, and saw as a sign of perhaps progress. But there was a real concern among some too that there were people who were appointed who were not in holy orders, who were not priests or not bishops. And so it'll be interesting to see what he does when there are openings in Rome.
Well, you've hit on two elements that I think were partly why Robert Prevost was chosen Pope. The first is that very question of the law, that some of this was ad hoc. You know, there's a term for some papal documents called a motu proprio, which means by my own hand. So it's basically the Pope issuing a motu proprio. Popes issue motu proprio. It's dealing usually with some aspect of canon law or something they want to fix. Francis issued well over 75 of them over a 12-year period, far and away more than his predecessor, certainly Pope Benedict. Many of those are not questionable because he had every right to do that as Pope. He's a supreme lawgiver, but it raised other questions. And in practice now, One of the things that Pope Leo is going to have to deal with, and his skills as a canon lawyer, I think, are going to be very handy here, is how are some of those going to be applied? Do they need to be tweaked a little bit? Do we need to revisit some of these? Think of it for an audience, well, those in your audience who aren't necessarily familiar with Catholic theology, think of it almost like a presidential executive order.
Mm.
Yes, it has weight, but a successor, the next president, can certainly rescind them or issue his own. And that, in many cases, is what Francis did. But the other point that you just made, and it's an important one, was brought up specifically among the cardinals when they met before the conclave by a retired cardinal named Beniamino Stella, who was actually made a cardinal by Pope Francis, who complained about the fact that he seemed to be, especially where it came in terms of the Roman Curia, the government of the church, severing what had always been a position like being a prefect of one of the major offices overseeing the governance of the church and serving the Pope and doing that from holy orders. And it has created some interesting challenges so that you have, for example, someone who might be a president or a prefect who still needs to have a cardinal reporting to her because there are certain things that she can't do because it might involve things like orders. In other words, priests and bishops. So how that's going to be fixed, I think, is something that Pope Leo will have to contend with. At the same time, he seems comfortable with continuing this idea of expanding the voice and role of women, certainly the governance of the church, but how he'll finesse this is another thing. And it's very clear that he is not in favor in any way with something like the ordination of women to the priesthood.
You make the point, you said this earlier, that he's this figure who will be integrating things. And you make the point that he'll be integrating his Augustinian tradition, the Leonine tradition that he's made more than a hat tip to in taking the name Leo. But integrating in such a way that it's all Christological, all pointing to Christ. What exactly does that mean, and how is it significant?
Right. Well, it's funny
It may
because
be
he's
different.
yes. Well, he said at one point to Cardinal Fernando Filoni, and I think this has been repeated by a few other cardinals, and this isn't betraying any secrets of the conclave because it's sort of separate from that. That he had initially thought, when it was clear he was going to be elected, taking the name Augustine. Pretty interesting pick. Similar to Pope Jorge Maria Bergoglio picking the name Francis.
Right.
It's an interesting choice. It would have told us a lot right from the start. But then he went with Leo, precisely for all the reasons that we talked about, the great challenge of the Industrial Revolution, Rerum Novarum, Catholic social teaching, and all of that. But what's clear is that in every speech so far, he references Augustine in some fashion. So he's an expert in patristics, in other words, the fathers of the church, because he pulls in all of these amazing references
Yeah.
to obscure doctors of the church, like Ephraim the Syrian, or theologians like Simeon the New Theologian. People who are known mostly in the Orthodox, among the Orthodox churches, or Gregory of Narek, the 10th century Armenian doctor of the church, obscure but important figures in the life of the church.
Now
So
he is one that Pope Francis canonized out of the blue, right?
yes, and declared a doctor of the church.
Yeah.
Part of this desire for the whole church to recognize the importance of Eastern Christianity, of Eastern spirituality, and Eastern theology. I say all of that because in his life as an Augustinian, there is this pursuit of truth. Augustine took as his lifelong effort to know the truth. And I think we see that in Leo. But having that encounter with God then impels you to go out. The love of God impels you to love of neighbor, which is one of the hallmarks of the Augustinian rule. So we're seeing that on the one hand, all of this rich Augustinian tradition of the beautiful writings of the Confessions of the City of God, of the hundreds of homilies that have been preserved, thank heavens, since the 5th century. But then he has this great tradition of Catholic social teaching as sort of embodied by Leo XIII, who gave it so much form at the end of the 19th century of applying the timeless teachings of the church to these new situations. Both are concerned, though, with the same thing, and that is the human person made in the image and likeness of God. Pursuit of truth, pursuit of the love of God, the love of neighbor, the personal conversion of a person, but then also the defense of the human person, pursuit of the common good, anchors of Catholic social teaching. But they're both being pulled together by Leo in the one thing that when we started our conversation a little while ago, in ilo uno unum, in unity, only unity in Christ. So he sees this then as these two threads, these two beautiful treasures, but seen through the peace of the risen Christ. So that's why I do think, all popes are going to be Christocentric.
Right.
Christ has to be the heart of everything. But I think Leo's really trying to apply that these two different journeys lead to Christ, who alone can give us the peace that the world needs. We go back to our hearts are restless until they rest in you. And I think that's something that he is going to proclaim to the world, but also to the church.
I was really struck in recent days about by this image we saw, this little girl who genuflected and kissed Pope Leo's ring, and obviously he's a little more comfortable with that, for lack of a better way to put it, than Pope Francis was. And what I was struck by, obviously, there's this tradition that's returning a bit, in terms of that kind of formal encounter with the Pope. But why I find it striking is because I thought, I mean, I saw it clearly. I don't know. I think other people see it like this. It's not so much as she is genuflecting to the Pope, but the Vicar of Christ on earth. It's something similar to when I, a New Yorker, when I see I'm frequently in situations where I see people around Cardinal Dolan and meeting him for the first time. And it is so clear to me, they're not excited because they're meeting a celebrity, though he may be that. This is the closest they're going to get to meeting the Pope, which is the closest they're going to get to meeting Christ on earth. That's the feeling, that's the approach. And this is what this girl was doing, what this signified. And I remember the one time I met Pope Benedict, it was unquestionable. He was looking at me with the eyes of God the Father, which I can't quite explain, but that's what we're talking about in this return to tradition and this focusing on Christ. It's not about Leo, Pope Bob, Roberto, whatever. It's about Christ.
No, you're absolutely right. It is a self consciousness, but not a presumption or pride or arrogance of the office. When he walked out on that loggia, he chose to wear the traditional mozzetta, that beautiful shoulder cape, and he had the traditional stole. You could look back on the images of like Benedict XVI and John Paul II, but you could go all the way back to Pius XI and Leo XIII, that he was anchoring himself from that beginning. And this wasn't a rejection of Francis. It was Francis's style. He eschewed that because he was trying to make a point. Leo is trying to make a point too, that he is very comfortable with the Petrine office, but not in a lordly sense, but in a respect for the office that really does shine through. It's why from the very beginning of his assumption of the papacy, he has been comfortable with called the baciamano, which is the kissing of the ring. Francis, that was his style. He didn't like it very much. But Leo, recognizing that what we need now is a certain return to formality, but also a return to an understanding innately of the symbols of the office so that we develop a deeper respect and even affection for the office itself. And we saw that in his installation mass. It was technically called the Mass of Initiation for the Petrine Office of the Bishop of Rome. And I give the full title because that's really what he is coming to embody so interestingly in an era in which everything is up for grabs. Everything is greeted with a sort of iconoclastic temperament. That nothing is formal, nothing is serious, nothing needs to be respected. Everything should be greeted with cynicism and suspicion. He is returning to a kind of formality that's not stiff or antiquated. He's not anachronistic, but it's a recognition that he is part of something very important and something very spiritual that brings us into direct contact with something beyond. Mm-hmm. And so he, from that moment on the loggia, was channeling. You could see his awareness of the weight of the office. And I think that is really important. And at that installation mass, he received the obedience, not just of the cardinals, but of the whole church with representatives. And that's what he did the other day. So I think it's also sending that message of not just obedience, but a recognition of the office of Pope, of the Bishop of Rome and head of the Universal Church. And I was really, the images for that were quite remarkable.
Mm. And there were some people on social media who were hoping that he'd bring back the papal tiara, or it's probably wise that he didn't do that. But in all seriousness, actually, one of the reasons
where
they hold him up, yes, that's not like they did in the Jude Law series on the Pope. Yes, it's best that he not do that. But yeah. But actually, a serious point about that, he, unlike perhaps any pope ever, gets the media and has thought about the mass media's impact on people. I mean, the Pope has an iWatch, an Apple Watch. This is new. I watched Benedict the first time he tweeted. The man had never seen an iPad before. It seemed quite clear. So that we're dealing with something new. And how significant is that?
I think it's immensely significant. Pope Francis was something of he was a pathfinder in many ways, because it was during his pontificate that I think social media really became such a thing. Mm-hmm. And I think he understood. I mean, his interest in AI, for example, that great document, Antica et Nova, what is old and new, really was ahead of the curve in terms of understanding the dimensions of the new technologies, but also the importance of social media. Mm-hmm. I think, however, in Pope Leo XIV, we have somebody who really, to your point, has been thinking about this for a long time. He's talked about it over the years. He talked about it in 2012. He's still talking about it. I think he understands first the importance of it, as anyone who's a student of the Second Vatican Council, especially the document Inter Mirifica, which calls on us as a church to use all the means of social communications at our disposal to proclaim the gospel, but also then to take part in culture and society, again, for the pursuit of the common good. So he sees that, but then he also recognizes the immense threats that are existing in social media today. The dehumanizing aspects, the way that it can really create fragmentation and untruth, and now with AI, deep fakes, and long-standing person, I hate the term fake news, but the falsehoods that he perpetrated. And he himself was victimized by this 38-minute fake video that came out just a week ago. So he understands
an actual speech that was supposedly him that wasn't, that right. AI had created. It's terrifying, actually.
Right. Yeah. I mean, it's impressive.
Yeah.
But he's also recognizing the existential problems that creates, the epistemological questions. What can we know now in a universe, in a reality that can have that type of falsehood? And I think this is something that he's going to be thinking a lot about. And I personally look forward to seeing where he takes us with that. But he, as you say, this is something he's been thinking about for a while. But he also sees the importance of it, which is why I found it so interesting that within an hour or two of the launch of his X page, where he was up to 16 million followers, because there is also really intense interest in him.
Well, I had to laugh too. I think it was it was the first or second day of the X page. And during a particular hour, there was a spurt of a whole bunch of X posts, tweets, whatever we call them now.
Yeah.
And people were wondering what was up with. I have no idea why they made that decision, but I said, well, the poor man has been off Twitter for a bunch of days, so of course it's like me in an Uber catching up. I just keep retweeting or posting.
Right.
But
One of my one of my side favorite interviews was I'm pretty sure it's not a fake. Was Cardinal Bihok of Australia, who was asked what was it like to not be able to use your phone. He had to be cut off from the outside world during the conclave because he was one of the youngest of the cardinals. And he said it was great. He loved the fact that he was cut off. He said you should try it.
you have no choice in the matter. They actually take your phones,
They literally take your phone. Yes.
although they still have jamming devices just in case. I have to ask you one last question. I also on the point of the acts, just there is something interesting about the fact that we have a pope who had his own personal Twitter account. Your colleague Kathryn Hadro in the first moments realized that he had retweeted her husband not once but three times,
Right.
which I said I'd put in my bio. I hope Matthew's done that by now. But yeah, no, he knows the impact that screens have on people,
Right.
and I think that's important.
Yeah. And for the record, he was pretty active in retweeting, especially articles on the pro-life cause.
Yeah,
Everyone focused, unsurprisingly, on sort of, I think he retweeted something, JD Vance and all of that.
yeah, an America piece on
Yeah.
immigration.
But when you look at sort of the totality of his social media presence, he's a lot like I am. I don't have that many followers because I tend just to retweet because I just don't want to get into the wars.
Although one of his original tweets was a picture from a Peruvian March for Life,
Right,
which says
exactly.
something.
Right, exactly. So it tells us something about what his priorities were as a missionary, as a bishop in Peru. His opposition, for example, to gender ideology in Peru, where I believe he at one point tweeted about that too. So when you look at it, you see somebody who, dare I say, he's Catholic.
The Pope is in fact Catholic. I have to ask you one other question before I let you go. Um, as you know, you among them, I have a lot of friends at EWTN, and I am genuinely excited for you and praying for you. Mother Angelica was an American, the founder of EWTN, and such a remarkable figure in her own right. But having an American Pope, being at EWTN, founded by an American, this is a remarkable moment for EWTN, isn't it?
It is, and I think the you alluded to the fact that this over this last month we have had millions of people come to us for our coverage, and yeah, we're obviously very happy about it, but we also recognize the immense responsibility that that brings.
Yeah.
Uh, and in our coverage of the passing of Pope Francis, I think you'd be hard pressed to find a more comprehensive approach to his passing, to the legacy that he leaves behind us, remarkable accomplishments of his pontificate. And then our approach to the whole interregnum, the Sede Vacante, was that we are a family of faith. And I think that's one of the things that set us apart from a lot of the other coverage, even among some of the Catholic outlets that were covering it, in that we see this as the passing of the Holy Father, but he's our Father. So this was a death in the family.
Mm-hmm.
And then everything that means.
Right.
The always the 9 days of mourning had particular meaning for us. It's why we broadcast every night, before the Mass each day and then after the Mass each day, to talk about the homilies that were given,
Mm.
to help. If I use the phrase in our coverage that this was a journey that began in some ways on February 14th when Pope Francis first went into Gemelli Hospital and never really recovered
Right.
from respiratory problems. But it began in very serious sense with his passing on Easter Monday. This is a journey that all of us who are members of the Catholic faith, but also people of goodwill all over the world, we took together. And it was a journey that had a lot of emotion, certainly as a Catholic, as a believer, to cover the funeral, to attend that funeral, but then to have that moment of Habemus Papam, to see the white smoke. Those are moments that really stay with you, but those are moments of deep faith that can really touch you, and I will remember them for the rest of my life.
And it is remarkable, and there's no question. I mean, people are drawn to, even if they don't have the gift of faith, even if they aren't conscious of it, there is this beauty and tradition that is magnetized, is drawing you in. um,
Yeah,
and thank you for what you're
when you
doing to make sure that there's something for people to connect with.
Yeah, I go back to some of the tweets or posts or whatever they are, talking about there's no aesthetic quite like the Catholic aesthetic.
Right.
Shots of the funeral, it was shots of the translation of Pope Francis's remains. And then that procession from the Pauline Chapel into the Sistine Chapel by the members of the college, who then one by one took an oath under the gaze of Michelangelo's painting of the Last Judgment. I mean, for just the sheer drama of the moment, whether you're Catholic or not, the beauty of that, it was something that really did rivet. The whole world was fascinated by it. I went back and I watched some of the other networks and their coverage, and they too. I mean, these are ardent secularists in most cases, but they were absolutely stunned and they just couldn't look away because of the drama of the moment, but also it really does point to something deeper, more significant, something that is eternal. And for us as a network to be able to help people have that journey and that encounter, it's very, very important to us.
The moment which I watched on EWTN that I will never forget, and I've watched a couple of times now, is when the cardinals processed after he was elected, processed into the basilica, and Pope Leo went down to the remains of Saint Peter.
Yes.
Um, and there was this moment. So he obviously was praying at the remains of Saint Peter, the first pope, and but there's this moment where he smiled. There was a smallest smile, and it was almost like we were we were allowed into a little window of his interaction, his conversation with God the Father as he was about
Right.
to be officially installed as Pope. It was remarkable the things you can do with television, that we all
Yeah.
got to
Well,
see that so up close.
we give credit to the Vatican media because they had drones that really enhanced, I think, the whole of those moments.
Hmm.
Then to have that transparency that I think Leo really wants, that, but you're right, that smile where he sort of turns back and just gives that little smile to Peter,
Yeah,
whose successor he now is.
yeah.
It's a snapshot into his prayer life, but it's also a snapshot into sort of his sense of humor.
Yeah. And
It
I think,
has,
well, and if we had any doubt about that, I think getting to know his brothers has made that clear, that there's an interaction there that is priceless. Well, Matthew Bunson, I'm sorry I've kept you so long. We could keep
this is a fun
talking.
conversation.
It's a fun conversation. Again, my background is not cooperating, but I saw your book launch in Rome, pictures of it, and you had that huge backdrop. You need that with a picture of your book.
Right?
Portrait of the First American Pope, Leo the 14th by Matthew Bunson. It's a really great primer. I've been teasing you on social media. I was very skeptical one could put a book together on this relatively unknown cardinal, but it's super helpful. Just to give a sense of the background, um, of his Augustinian background, his personal background, and where we are as a church right now.
Right. Yeah, exactly. So, no, I appreciate it. And that's why we call it a portrait.
Yeah.
Uh, this is an opportunity to have a glimpse at this man, to go away from reading this book with a better understanding of who he is and how he ended up Pope, because it's a story that is pretty amazing.
And I think the book, by the way, for people who aren't Catholic, it's super accessible. I think it's a great gift to give if you are Catholic. If you have friends, colleagues who have been having conversations about the church, who are curious about the Pope, who are curious about the church, it's a great little window in, a starter, if you will.
Thank you. I appreciate it. And especially the sections on American Catholicism.
Yeah.
Uh, yeah, because that's where he came from. And I think that's he's going to have a very lasting impact on the church in the United States.
And I also think it's striking that you describe your kind of introduction to the idea of Prevost as Pope the same way, in many respects, Cardinal Dolan describes it. He showed up in Rome. People are asking him about Prevost. He's like, well, I've heard good things, but I don't know him. And I better get to
Classic
meet him.
Dolan.
He had the benefit that he's Cardinal Dolan, so he could go introduce himself. You weren't at the same lunches, I
No,
trust, but anyhow, so you're well positioned to be telling this story. So thank you, Matthew Bunson, and go get the book. EWTN.com is a great resource for all things Catholic, and thank you. And nationalreview.com will continue to bring you conversations like this. Thank you.